The year was 1865, and the frontier was a place of blood and broken promises. Evelyn Carter sat stiff-backed in a rickety wagon, hands clenched in her lap, knuckles white as bone. The wheels groaned over the rough trail, the scent of dust and sweat thick in the air. Jesse Rawlins rode beside her, one hand resting easy on a holster, the other gripping the reins. The outlaw had a smile carved out of arrogance, his gaze flicking to her every so often like he was admiring a piece of fine stock. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her father had been a respected rancher before men like Jesse had swept through, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. He had given his life trying to protect his land. Her mother and little brother, gone. And Evelyn? She had been taken, thrown over Jesse's saddle like a sack of stolen goods. Weeks had passed, and every day she fought to stay alive. She had learned to bite her tongue, to swallow her rage, to wait. "You'll make a good wife, darling," Jesse drawled, his voice a lazy poison, "once you stop fighting it." Eve turned her head away, eyes scanning the endless horizon, a stretch of land as empty as her hope. She had no illusions about what marriage meant to a man like Jesse. Ownership, possession. Her only prayer was escape. But where could she run? Outlaws prowled the hills. Indians raided settlers who wandered too far from safety. The wilderness itself was a death sentence. Still, she'd take death over Jesse. The wagon rattled into a trading post as the sun bled out across the sky. It was a pit of desperation, a scattering of buildings that smelled of whiskey, sweat, and gun oil. Men leaned against posts, their eyes following her as she climbed down, Jesse's fingers tightening around her arm. She didn't resist, not here, not now. He led her inside the main building, a dimly lit space thick with smoke and the clink of silver against wood. A heavy-set man sat behind the counter, eyes beady, lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but held none of the warmth. "You bring me what I asked for?" the man rasped. Jesse grinned, tilting his hat back. "That depends, old man. You bring me what you promised." The trader's gaze slid to Eve, his tongue darting out to wet his lips. Something in her stomach coiled, tight and cold. "She's a fine one," the man said, nodding. "But your skin too much." Jesse chuckled. "You know how hard it is to find a woman like this out here? Pretty, young, can work." He turned to Eve, gripping her chin, forcing her to look up at him. "And she's learned to listen real good." Eve's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a trade for supplies. It was a sale. The trader folded his arms. Horses, rifles, ammo. That was the deal. Jesse's fingers tightened until her jaw ached. "Then we got a problem, don't we?" For a moment, the world held still. A bead of sweat traced its way down the trader's temple. His fingers twitched at his side. Jesse's hand drifted toward his holster. Then came the sound of a rifle cocking. A shadow moved in the corner. A man who had been silent until now. He stepped forward, a Cheyenne warrior, dark-eyed and unreadable. His presence was a sudden, unexpected weight in the room. "Get out," the warrior said in thickly accented English. Jesse laughed, slow and easy. "Now, friend, this here ain't your fight." The first shot rang out. Jesse jerked back, eyes wide, a bloom of red staining his shirt. He staggered, but his hand still clawed for his gun. The trader had fired first. Another shot cracked through the room. Jesse crumpled. Chaos erupted. Men leapt from their seats, hands grabbing at weapons. The trader fell back, clutching his chest, gasping. Smoke filled the room. Shouting. The sound of boots slamming against the floor. Eve moved. Instinct overrode fear. Jesse's revolver had slipped from his fingers. She dove for it, fingers closing around the grip, the cool steel grounding her. A man lunged at her, but she was already rising, her arm steady, her heartbeat a hammer in her ears. She fired. The outlaw spun back, crashing into a table. Someone grabbed her wrist. She twisted, elbows slamming into soft flesh. A curse, a fist swinging toward her. She ducked, bolted for the door. Outside, the world was fire and thunder. Horses screamed. Gunshots cracked like lightning. A body hit the ground near her feet. She ran. Behind her, Jesse's men spilled out of the building, barking orders, scanning for her. She ducked between wagons, breath ragged. Then she saw it, Jesse's horse, still saddled, tied to a post. A gunshot split the air just as her fingers closed around the reins. Pain lanced through her shoulder, white-hot. But she gritted her teeth, yanking herself into the saddle. A voice, one of Jesse's men, shouted her name. She kicked the horse hard. It bolted. Wind toward her hair as she rode, her body screaming in protest, her vision swimming. The ground blurred beneath pounding hooves. Behind her, shouts. More gunfire. She didn't look back. The trees swallowed her whole, darkness closing in around her. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to keep riding. The night was a black void, the trees closing like silent sentinels as Evelyn pushed the horse forward, urging it deeper into the wilderness. The pain in her shoulder pulsed, hot and insistent, but she gritted her teeth, refusing to let it slow her. Jesse was dead, but his men wouldn't let that go unanswered. They would hunt her, kill her, maybe worse. The forest was a tangle of shadows and whispers. Every crack of a branch, every rustling leaf sent her pulse spiking. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling with exhaustion and cold. Blood seeped from the wound, soaking into the fabric of her dress. She needed to stop, to think, but stopping meant death. She had to keep moving. The river appeared without warning, its dark waters glinting like broken glass beneath the sliver of moonlight. The horse balked at the edge, nostrils flaring. Eve glanced back. Were they following? She couldn't hear them, but that meant nothing. They were outlaws, men who knew how to stalk prey without a sound. She tightened her grip on the reins. "Come on," she whispered. The horse hesitated, then stepped forward into the icy current. Water surged around them, biting through fabric, stealing the last of her warmth. Her fingers went numb, the reins slick with water and blood. The horse lurched, nearly toppling them both, but then they were through, scrambling up the opposite bank, hooves churning mud. Relief was fleeting. A shadow moved in the trees ahead. Her breath caught, her fingers clenching the revolver still tucked in her lap. She barely had the strength to lift it, but she would. She had no choice. A man stepped into the moonlight, tall, broad-shouldered, a rifle slung across his back, a tomahawk resting easily at his side. His dark eyes locked onto hers, unreadable, unwavering. More shadows stirred behind him. Not just one man. 3, 4, maybe more. Cheyenne. Her pulse roared in her ears. The man stepped closer, speaking words she didn't understand. His voice was deep, steady, edged with quiet authority. She gripped the revolver tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I don't mean any trouble," she rasped, her voice barely more than breath. The man tilted his head, considering her. Then, slowly, he reached out and took hold of her horse's reins. She jerked back, but the movement sent a fresh wave of agony through her wounded shoulder, her vision blurring with pain. One of the men behind him muttered something. A question, maybe. The leader didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her, gaze sharp and assessing. Then, without breaking eye contact, he gestured to her shoulder. She swallowed hard. The gun in her lap felt useless now. She couldn't even lift it, couldn't fight, couldn't run. The man seemed to recognize it too. Another low command, and the others moved. Before she could react, hands were pulling her from the saddle, firm but not rough. The world tilted, the pain too much, her limbs too weak. She gasped, the revolver slipping from her grasp, vanishing into the dark. Then the ground rose to meet her, and everything went black. She woke to firelight and unfamiliar voices. Her body felt like it had been torn apart and stitched back together with coarse thread. A thick, smoky scent filled the air, blending with something sharper. Herbs, maybe. She tried to sit up, but a hand pressed gently against a good shoulder, guiding her back down. She turned her head, and there he was, the man from before. Closer now. She could see the sharp lines of his face, the quiet strength in his expression. His dark hair hung in a thick braid over one shoulder, beads woven into the strands. His gaze was steady, unwavering. "You are safe," he said, the English thick on his tongue, but clear enough to understand. Her throat tightened. Safe? No, not yet. Maybe not ever. She licked her lips, her voice hoarse. Where? His eyes flicked toward the others around the fire, then back to her. My people's land. She turned her head, taking in the village beyond the fire's glow. Hide tents rose in neat rows. The silhouettes of horses, shifting in the moonlight. Women moved between fires, speaking in low voices, casting glances in her direction. Children peeked from behind their skirts, curiosity in their wide eyes. Captive, that was what she was. No different than before, just in different hands. She forced herself to sit up, ignoring the way the pain sliced through her. I need to go. The man didn't move, but something in his expression changed. You cannot. Her fingers curled into fists. I didn't ask permission. A muscle in his jaw tightened. You would die. She lifted her chin. That's my choice. He studied her for a long moment, then shook his head. Not yet. The finality in his voice sent a shiver through her. Not yet. Meaning what? He stood then, speaking to the others. Two of them nodded and disappeared into the night. She had the sense they were standing guard, not to protect her, to keep her from running. He turned back to her. Sleep. She wanted to fight, wanted to scream, but her body betrayed her. Exhaustion swallowed her whole. As her eyes drifted shut, she wondered if she had escaped one fate only to stumble into another. Eve awoke to silence, not the hollow cry of an empty place, but the kind that bristled with unseen movement, hushed voices carried by the wind, the kind of silence that told her she was being watched. Her body ached. The wound in her shoulder pulsed, her limbs stiff from exhaustion. Someone had cleaned and bound it while she was unconscious, but the fabric around it was damp, dark with blood. She sat up slowly, taking in the fire's dying embers, the distant shapes of people moving in the pale light of dawn. She wasn't tied. There were no bars, no walls to keep her in. But the village itself was a prison, its boundaries enforced by the watchful eyes of Cheyenne. A shadow shifted near the entrance of the tent. He was there, the man who had taken her reins, the man who had saved her, if that's what this was. His eyes met hers, dark and steady. He had been watching her, waiting. She swallowed, her throat raw. Who are you? For a moment, he said nothing, as if deciding whether she deserved an answer. Then finally, to Hiska, the name sat heavy in the space between them. She rolled it over in her mind, tracing the shape of it like a lock she didn't have the key for. I need to leave, she said, keeping her voice even. His gaze flicked to her wounded shoulder, then back to her face. You would not make it. She set her jaw. That's my choice. He studied her for a long moment, then, without a word, he turned and walked away. Eve exhaled, releasing a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The day passed in a haze. She was left alone, though never unwatched. Women passed by the tent, their gazes cautious but not unkind. A child peeked in once, wide-eyed, before being ushered away. No one spoke to her. No one told her what was to come. By nightfall, she was done waiting. She moved carefully, testing the limits of her pain. The wound would slow her, but not stop her. Not if she was careful. She gathered what little she could. She had no weapons, no food, only the clothes on her back. Still, she had her legs, and that would have to be enough. She slipped into the shadows beyond the tent, the village around her humming with quiet life. Fires flickered, casting shifting patterns across the ground. She kept to the edges, moving between the lodges, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. A few more steps, and she would be past the last fire, beyond the reach of their watchful eyes. Then a voice, quiet but firm. Stop. She froze. Tahiska stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Her breath came fast. Let me go. He didn't move. You cannot survive alone. Anger flared in her chest. Then let me die on my own terms. Something flickered across his face, something unreadable. He exhaled, then turned, walking past her into the dark. She hesitated, but when he glanced back, she understood. He wanted her to follow. A choice, then: stay in the village, where she was a prisoner, or follow him into the night, where she might find freedom or something else entirely. She followed. They walked in silence, moving away from the village, deeper into the wilderness. The stars stretched overhead, cold and distant. Her shoulder ached with every step, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving. After a time, he stopped. The land stretched before them, open and endless, the wind whispering through the grass. "Where would you go?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "Anywhere but here." He studied her, then reached for something at his side. A knife. She tensed, but he didn't raise it. Instead, he held it out to her, handle first. A test. She took it. The weight of it settled into her palm, solid and cold. She could drive it into his chest, take his horse, disappear into the night. He didn't move. She tightened her grip. The blade trembled. Then, slowly, she lowered it. He nodded once, as if he'd already known what she would choose. "You are strong," he said quietly, "but strength alone will not keep you alive." She looked away, her fingers loosening on the knife. Then, "Teach me." The corner of his mouth lifted, just barely, and so it began. For days, she trained. She learned to move without sound, to track the signs of life in the land around her. She learned how to bind a wound, how to fish with nothing but her hands. She learned the language of survival, spoken in gestures, in glances, in things unspoken. Tehiska was patient, but he did not coddle her. When she fell, he let her pick herself up. When she failed, he did not correct her. He simply waited for her to try again. She hated him for it, at first. Then she understood. She was not a prisoner. She was being tested. Each night, they sat by the fire, silence stretching between them. He did not ask about Jessie, about what she had lost. And she did not ask him why he had saved her, why he had chosen to teach her instead of letting her die. Some questions were better left unanswered, but she felt it creeping in the quiet moments, in the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. Something shifting, something dangerous. And just as she began to wonder what it meant, the past found her again. The gunshot split the night. She spun, heart hammering, the sound sharp and familiar, too familiar. Voices, rough and cruel, cutting through the darkness. Jessie's men. They had found her, and they were not alone. The first gunshot shattered the night, sending birds screaming from the trees. Eve's breath hitched as the echoes rolled over the hills, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the land. The fire flickered, casting sharp shadows across Tehiska's face. His gaze locked onto hers for the briefest moment, steady, searching, before he was moving, reaching for his rifle. They had found her. A second shot rang out, closer this time. The voices carried on the wind, rough and familiar, barking orders. Jessie's men, even with their leader dead, they had hunted her like wolves, tracking her across the land. And now they had come to finish what they started. Tehiska motioned for her to move, his voice low, urgent. "Go." But Eve didn't run. Not this time. She had spent too long being hunted, too long letting men decide her fate. She gripped the knife he had given her, its weight solid in her palm. Her body still ached, her shoulder throbbed, but her heart pounded with something stronger than fear. She would not be taken again. The brush trembled as shadows moved between the trees. The outlaws were closing in. Tehiska crouched low, his rifle raised, his breath calm and measured. He had survived too many battles to panic now. Eve whispered, "How many?" His gaze flicked toward the dark, reading the land as easily as breathing. 5. Maybe more. 5. Too many for a fight in the open. Tehiska gestured toward the ridge beyond them. If they could reach higher ground, they would have the advantage. But getting their men exposing themselves, and the outlaws weren't fools. They would be waiting for movement. Another shot cracked, kicking up dirt near her feet. No time to think. Tehiska fired, the sharp retort splitting the air. A cry of pain answered in the distance. One down, but the rest were coming fast, their boots pounding against the dry earth. Eve bolted, following Tehiska as he led them into the trees. The underbrush tore at her legs, branches snapping beneath her boots. Her breath came in sharp gasps, but she forced herself to keep moving. A shout from behind. "I see her." The next shot burned past her cheek, so close she could feel the heat of it. A rush of panic threatened to take her down, but she swallowed it, gripping the knife tighter. Keep moving. They reached the ridge, the incline steep. Eve scrambled up, dirt sliding beneath her hands. Tehiska was already ahead, rifle steady as he took another shot. A man fell below them, but more climbed after him. No escape, no more running. Tehiska turned to her, his voice fierce. "You know how to kill?" Eve's pulse roared in her ears. She had never taken a life before. She had fought. She had survived. But she had never made the choice to end another person's existence. But Jesse's men weren't just people. They were monsters. And if she hesitated, she would die. Tehiska pulled the tomahawk from his belt and pressed it into her hand. The weight of it was different from a gun, heavier, more intimate. There was no pulling a trigger from a distance. If she used this, she would have to feel it. A man reached the top of the ridge, gun raised. Eve didn't think. She lunged. The tomahawk sank into flesh, the resistance jolting up her arm. The man gasped, eyes wide with shock, before he crumpled to the ground. Blood soaked into the earth, dark and final. Her hands trembled, breath ragged. No time. Another outlaw appeared, firing wildly. Tehiska tackled him, the two of them rolling through the dirt. The gun went off between them, a deafening blast. For one terrifying second, Eve didn't know who had been hit. Then Tehiska rose, his knife slick with blood. More were coming. A gun clicked behind her. She turned too slow. The barrel pressed against her skull. "Should have just let us take you, girl." The voice was rough, bitter with rage. The outlaw twisted the gun against her temple. "You cost us too damn much." Eve's heart slammed against her ribs. Her fingers tightened on the tomahawk, but she wouldn't be fast enough. Tehiska's voice cut through the night. "Let her go." The outlaw laughed. "Or what? You'll put an arrow in me? Be smart, Chief. She's ours." The silence stretched, thick and unyielding. Eve's pulse raced. Then, in the smallest moment, she felt it. The outlaw's grip eased just a fraction. It was all she needed. She moved. The tomahawk slashed across his arm, sending the gun spinning. He roared in pain, but she was already turning, already driving the blade deep into his side. His breath hitched, his body crumpling against her. Dead. She staggered back, chest heaving. The blade slipped from her fingers. It was over. The last of the outlaws lay still in the dirt, the night quiet once more. Eve turned to Tehiska. He was watching her, unreadable, his breath coming just as fast as hers. She had killed. She had chosen to fight. And she was still standing. Something shifted between them. Something unspoken but undeniable. Not a prisoner. Not a victim. Something else entirely. She took a step forward. "It's done." Tehiska nodded. But there was something in his gaze that told her he had known all along how this would end. He had seen it before she had. A test, and she had passed. The wind stirred around them, carrying the scent of blood and earth, of fire and survival. The past had been buried here tonight, laid to rest in the bodies of the men who had once controlled her fate. She turned toward the horizon. Freedom. It had always been just out of reach, a distant dream she had barely dared to believe in. But now she was free. She felt Tehiska move beside her, his presence steady, unwavering. She glanced at him. "Where do we go from here?" His answer was simple. "Wherever you choose." For the first time in her life, she believed it.